Iku mau mau, iku lah. Iku mau mau, iku hulu hulu ikala na vau. Iku lah. Iku lah na vau. Iku lah. Iku lah.
Aloha. All right, hope you guys are ready for rock and roll because we got a lot of information to disseminate. Ron Williams, I met him about a month, 2 months ago at a presentation he had done in Lahaina. You know, all my life, I almost had to defend myself, my own faith when I run out of kanakas. Oh, here comes a lot of believer. You know, part of the usurping body. And I always feel like I gotta put up the wall, you know what I mean? I gotta protect myself. When I heard this brother speak, he kept me at the edge of my seat. And everything that he had to share brought confirmation to everything that I've held by faith for a lifetime. You know, talk about kanaka evidence, the brother would share them all. I was like, oh my goodness. It just brought confirmation. It made me feel really good that I wasn't believing in a lie or just something, a figment of my imagination, you know. But it was something that was a factual thing that even our own people back in the day, they were pretty radical. They never just sit back and watch everything roll. They actually would roll the punches, actually. And so this is one of those times this evening. And the beautiful part is that Brother Weshia in his previous presentation that he was a Buddhist. He's not even one Christian, but the presentation that he had to offer touched many different venues, historical facts, and it blessed my heart. So I went to him after. I said, hey bro, we're going to do an up in the Valley. I'll you come share with the people. You know, your manao and everything. And he accepted, so we're honored and blessed to have Brother Ron Williams here. Tonight, after this presentation, if you ohana when misa, and it's something that will touch you on a certain level, invite you ohana come out again tomorrow evening. I'll be out Valley in the holiday. 7 o'clock, Brother gonna roll again. Touch on, you can keep one thread, but an expanded version of what needs to be shared tonight. So, without further ado, time for me to close my mouth and pass the mic on to my brother here from Honolulu, Brother Ron Williams. Come on up, I'll give you my mic.
Aloha mai ka po. O Ron ko inoa, o Ronald Williams Jr. ko inoa pia. E hao manawau I ke kula nui o University of Mamanoa. I loko ke kula Kamakakokalani Center for Hawaiian Studies. I loko ka Hawaii nui Hakea. My name is Ron Williams Jr. I'm a student in the History Department at UH Manoa. I also teach. I teach at the Center for Hawaiian Studies at UH Manoa. It's a pleasure to be here. I thank Kumuhanale, Kehele, Kumukiopi, and everybody for bringing me out here. It's great to see all you guys here today, such a wonderful crowd, such a big crowd. I think a lot of activities have gone on today that have kind of really been powerful and opened their eyes. I wasn't here today, I just flew in about a half an hour ago, but I've seen some of these presentations before and they're really powerful. So I hope to just add a little bit to that tonight. So I'll tell you what we're going to do, and then hopefully at the end also you'll have questions. That's the best part for me, the fun part for me. But really the theme today, the theme of my presentation is KANI I KA PO, yeah? Resounding in the darkness, which it has really two meanings. The first meaning, KANI I KA PO, comes from a chapter of my dissertation that I'm working on. Let me back up a little bit. My mother is Janet Marie Labounty. She comes from Chicago, Illinois, from France through Quebec down to Chicago. My father is Ron Williams Sr. My father comes from Arkansas and Oklahoma. He's a fisherman and a hunter, still lives there. I came out to California when I was a teenager. I'm malahini to Hawaii. I came to Hawaii in 1997. Came to Maui, lived in Lahaina, worked at Luau. Yeah, Pisilele. And then my daughter was born. I have a 14-year-old daughter now. She was born and I realized, well, not everyone wants to see a 50-year-old with his shirt off, so I gotta get a real job. So I went back to school at 33. I came back here to this place, this wonderful, wonderful college. My first kumu was Kiopi Raymond, who taught me much and set me on the right path. And then MCC had a program that brought students over to UH Manoa to check it out, called Rainbow Bridge, and I went over there on that program.
And I was incredibly fortunate to meet somebody named Mehana Hine. Mehana was the academic counselor over there. And we get off the bus, and everybody goes to their different programs. And people walking down to Hawaiian Studies was about 12 Hawaiians and me. And I go down there, and Mehana pulled me aside, and she said, Ron, if you decide to come here, this is your home too. You're going to eat with us, you're going to pray with us, you're going to be here with us. And it's been like that ever since. I got my bachelor's degree in Hawaiian Studies in 2005, focusing on Olelo and Malama. I got my master's degree in 2008 in Pacific Island Studies, which is kind of similar, but just a broader context, yeah? You look at Tahiti and Aotearoa and so forth. And right now I'm working on a PhD in Hawaiian history. And I'm really proud of not my work per se, but of the fact that we have that degree in it at all. It's a brand new degree at Hawaii, at UH, which is really something to think about if we pause for a second. University of Hawaii, just 4 years ago, started a PhD in Hawaiian history. And we've always had a PhD in Korean history, and European history, and American history, and now after 100 years, we have a PhD in Hawaiian history. So, we're starting to learn. So, that's the program I'm in now. I've recently passed my comprehensive exams. I'm writing my dissertation. I'm writing it as we speak. You just don't see me. And hopefully I'll be done soon. So that's who I am. So, aloha. So, KANI I KA PO. Most of my work over the last 10 years, my MA thesis and my dissertation, focuses on Hawaiian language sourcing. And the reason why it is because I learned really quickly on. I had a wonderful kumu named Noe Silva. And I realized really early on that if you're talking about Hawaii in the 19th century, you need to listen to Hawaiian voices. Yeah. For 100 years, up until very, very recently, we've had the history of Hawaii told about Hawaiians, not from Hawaiians. Yeah. And that's starting to change. Some wonderful, wonderful work is being done and starting to change, but we've still just touched the tip of the iceberg. Yeah. KANI I KA Po talks about these voices that have been displaced and covered over that are now starting to be heard. They're themselves making themselves heard. Yeah? And that's what's really exciting for me. It also speaks specifically to an incident that I'm going to talk about a little bit tonight. It's also in my dissertation. And that is, my dissertation looks at the native Hawaiian Protestant congregations in the latter part of the 19th century. So the American Protestants who came here in 1820, what happened to those congregations around the 80s and 90s, around events like the bayonet and the overthrow? How did native Hawaiian Christians react to those events? Especially when their administration started telling them that the Queen was heathen and that they needed to follow them. How did they react? And we'll talk about how they reacted during tonight, okay? So that's what we're going to do. Let's get started. Okay. So, a lot of the things you saw today, a lot of the events you saw, and the things you saw, talked about, showed you Hawaiian voice, showed you the anti-annexation petitions, tens of thousands of people who spoke up, right? But that's all new. Prior to Noe Silva, prior to a lot of other people, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, the story was Hawaiians just kind of accepted it. They're passive, they're docile, they just kind of accepted what had happened to them. Now we're starting to see that, no, they didn't. Not only a few people, not only a dozen people, not only hundreds of people, thousands of people stood up and said no. Yeah? And that's the story that we're starting, these are the voices we're starting to hear. We see people and things like, on the far left up there, you see Nawahine of Huiloha Aina, yeah? In the center is the Queen. The Queen obviously spoke up. On the right, you see the men of Huiloha Aina. On the bottom left, you see Queen Emma. Yeah? A story that we don't often talk about, hasn't really been written about, is in 1862, yeah, Queen Emma and Alexander Liholiho bring the Anglican Church to Hawaii. Yeah? The purpose is the first purpose is to baptize their son, who actually passes away, sadly, just as the boat arrives, a little bit before the boat arrives. But Queen Emma insists that the church sets up churches and schools. And she sets up a school here on Maui in Lahaina called Lua'ehu. Yeah? Lua'ehu was the site of the first constitution. It's the home of Kiha in Lahaina, right? And there at Lua'ehu, she set up a school called Lua'ehu that was to educate young Hawaiian men to rise up to be future leaders of the kingdom. Now what does that sound like? That sounds like Lahaina Luna, yeah? That was a contestation of Lahaina Luna. The American Protestant Church had Lahaina Luna up the hill, and we always talk about Hawaiian education as Lahaina Luna. The Queen set up a school down at Lua'ehu that was, a lot of the children were British Hawaiian, but it was a school to raise Hawaiian children up to be future leaders. It was already a contestation of saying, hey, we got this, I know what we're doing. So that was the Queen. Next to the Queen is a gentleman that's kind of a focus of my research for the last 8 or 10 years, is William Punoho Aveoveo Uno Kalani White. Yeah? William White. It's hard to run across people who who are familiar with him, he's probably one of the most significant Native Hawaiians of that 1880s and 90s period. And we don't hear about it. Yeah. He was a lawyer, he was a legislator from Lahaina, he was a confidant of the Queen. He was one of the 2 men that helped the Queen write the new Constitution that she was trying to implement. On January 14th, 1893, she awarded William Punahou White and Joseph Navahi the Knight's Order of Kalakaua, the highest order in the kingdom. She called him a great patriot of the nation. So why don't we know about him today? Yeah, I'll tell you in a second. Next to him is Ellen Prendergast, right, who wrote Kaula Napua. And on the far right, we have Emma Navahi. Okay? A few examples of the thousands and thousands of Po'eloha Aina who spoke up and wrote down their manalo, yeah, that we just haven't heard yet. So, why? Why haven't we heard it? Yeah? In short, the answer is historiography. Yeah? Historiography is kind of one of my favorite words lately. It's just a really fancy way of saying how you come up with history, the process of the creation of history. Yeah? This is a history book. This is history. How this author came up with this is his or her historiography. Who did they talk to? Who didn't they talk to? What sources did they use? Did they use just English language sources, or did they access Hawaiian sources? Yeah. That's their historiography. And the plain fact is, 99% of what's published today about Hawaii has used only English language sources to talk about the history. So what does that mean? Helen Chapin wrote a book called Newspapers of Hawaii. She talks quite a bit about the population and newspapers and so forth. She says that at the time of the overthrow, that English language press, the main paper was called the Pacific Commercial Advertiser, which we still have today in a way. That Pacific Commercial Advertiser and that English language press represented the foreign community, which was about 6% of the population. So most everything we know about Hawaii came from the mouth of 6% of the people that were here. The other 94% spoke, and they wrote, and they chanted, and they wrote mele, but we haven't listened to their voices yet, in general. Yeah? So tonight we're going to focus on those voices. Okay? I'll give you a little analogy before I move on. If you were writing the history, and that's the thing that kind of is frustrating about this work and this study, is that you couldn't get away with this in most places. If you're going to write a history of Henry VIII, you don't go dig up all what the Japanese said about Henry VIII and write his biography. Right? It's like you were going to write the history of the United States, and you get a committee together, say it's 1900, and you get a committee together and you hire this world-famous historian. He's Italian. He's the best historian out there. Amazing guy. And he comes to the U.S. National Archives, and he walks in and he tells the woman at the front desk, he says, bring me everything you've got in there. He doesn't speak English. He says, give me everything you've got inside the archives that's written in Italian. So she goes back there. There's 5 billion documents, which isn't really a stretch at the archives. 5 billion documents. And she goes back in the corner, and there's about 5,000 that are written by Italian Americans, and she pulls those out and gives them to him. And he goes and sits in the corner, and he takes his notos, and he gets his pencil out, and he writes the history of the United States. And that becomes a textbook, and that becomes a movie, and that becomes an after-school special, and that becomes a pamphlet, and that becomes a, second grader's education. That becomes the history of the United States. That's what's happened here in Hawaii. Yeah? We've gotten history from a small percentage of the population. So when I talk about missing Hawaiian language sources, what am I talking about? Specifically, what am I talking about? Some of the major stuff that's out there. Nupepa Olelo Hawaii, Hawaiian language newspapers. Many of you have probably heard about them, yeah? Some of you are intimately familiar with them. About 125 different Hawaiian language newspapers published in the 19th century. One of the most robust presses in the world. Today we have about 125,000 pages of Hawaiian language newspapers. And we've accessed maybe 5% of them for research. But Hawaiians wrote prolifically in these Hawaiian language newspapers. Leka Olelo Hawaii, Hawaiian language letters. Bishop Museum, Hawaiian Mission Children's Society, Hawaiian Historical Society, State Archives, tens of thousands of letters from Maka'ainana to Maka'ainana, from Maka'ainana to the Ali'i, from the Ali'i back and forth, from the legislature. Tens of thousands of letters written in Hawaiian. Correspondences that weren't accessed by Ralph Kuykendall and Gavin Dawes and other gentlemen who have written the history of Hawaii. My dissertation looks at specifically, recently there was a collection in the Bishop Museum that was just opened up. The Judd collection. I get goosebumps thinking about it. Jarrett P. Judd and then his son Albert Francis Judd were intimately involved in most of the events of the Hawaiian Kingdom throughout its history. Their entire collection of materials, the largest manuscript collection in the state of Hawaii, about 95 Hollinger boxes, about 80,000 documents, was given to Bishop Museum in 1922. It was put under restriction that no one, not even the staff, could look at it until the last grandchild died. DeSoto Brown is the collections manager there, and he used to tease me. I used to go in and ask about stuff, and he's like, oh, it's probably in the joint collection, but you can't look at that. And then one day, he's got kind of a macabre sense of humor. I went in there one day, and he goes, hey, the guy died. But and rest his soul. But Juddy III, Albert Francis Judd's great-grandson, passed away in 2006, and the collection came open. And this is a collection that Ralph Kuykendall and Pauline King and Gavin Dawes and so forth asked to be admitted to, and they weren't. I mean, no one has looked at this. And it's got tens of thousands of letters in Hawaiian. My focus is these letters from native pastors. There's native pastors throughout the islands, thousands of letters from the native pastors to the Hawaiian Evangelical Association about what's going on in their churches. So all this information is available to us now. These Hawaiian voices we can listen to. So that's the type of stuff. Kuka kama elio makulelo Hawaii. These oral interviews that Mrs. Fukui has done, and others. Kaleo Hawaii radio program. There's thousands of hours of these on tape at Bishop Museum, at UH, and other places. The material is out there. Yeah. Okay, so I just want to give you, I don't want to keep you here all night, so I'll kind of move along. But I want to give you a couple examples, and you have to trust me, there are thousands. In my 10 years of doing research in the newspapers, I don't think there's a topic I've come across that I'm not blown away by what I'm reading in the Hawaiian as opposed to what I read in the English. Kekumu Hawaii, the death of Nahiana. Princess Nahiana dies on December 30th, 1837. A very long story short, she had a child in September of 1836, the child of Kauikeoli, her brother. The child was going to be the prince and passed away about a couple hours after his birth. She goes back to the prince's house. It was called Hale'uluhe. It was down near where Queens Hospital is today. And she passes away. She was sick, and she passes away on December 30th. He was grief-stricken, very much so. And he didn't want to release her body. He kept her body there until April. So he had her for 4 months. The newspaper kept writing in saying, when is he going to bury her? He kept her there at his house. He had a first funeral for her in February. And then in April, he bought a Spanish ship called the Kitote and sailed to Lahaina, Maui, and buried her at Lahaina, Maui, Ho'ohula. But that first funeral, in February at Kawaiahao, first kind of ceremonial funeral, was held. And it was written about in the papers. And these things are very important for people like anthropologists and historians and so forth. I've seen entire dissertations written on a funeral procession. Who's in front, who's next to the ali'i, who's sitting on the right of the ali'i. These things are very important to historians and anthropologists. So let's look. If you look at the Hawaiian language newspaper, Kekumu from that day, it has like a whole lewa ana Nahiana, right? It has her funeral. The light's all tied. Can I dim it up here? Okay. So Kekumu Hawaii. Here's the big page, and I've blown it up. They've got an actual image of the casket with the funeral procession. And if you look at it closely, the very top, okay, kahi poi koa mamua. Yeah, so in the very front of the funeral, you've got Hawaiian warriors leading the funeral. Right behind the warriors, you've got kahuna lapa ao mai. So you've got Hawaiian warriors, you've got kahuna lapa ao mai. This is 1837. Behind them, you've got Aona missionary mai. Okay, so you've got Hawaiian warriors, you've got kahuna lapa ao, you've got the missionaries in the funeral. Well, if you're the average historian, if you're most historians and you don't read in Hawaiian, you can't access this, right? So what do you look for? You look at the English language paper. Sandwich Island Gazette published about the funeral too. Nahiana has died, here's her funeral. They've got a map also. But their map, at the very top, has missionaries. And the kahuna lapa ao mai are missing. And the the koa are missing. Yeah? And it might seem like a small deal, but when somebody accesses this material and not that material, and then writes a paper about it, or and starts to say, wow, as early as 1837, this is how Pili, the missionaries were to Pili. This is how much power they had, was that they were leading the funeral of the highest ranking woman in the kingdom. Yeah? That's how history gets made. That's one of the problems of only accessing those English language sources. Another story that I'm working on right now is the first territorial legislature in Hawaii. So annexation supposedly happens, right, 1898. The Thurston gang are excited, really happy about it, but they've got a huge problem. By becoming a territory, all of a sudden you have, quote, democracy, right? So, was under Bayonet Constitution, was under PG Executive Committee, but now everybody gets to vote, and they're way outnumbered. So, what are they going to do? Hawaiians come together, organize, form the Home Rule Party and some other political parties, and they outnumber the Howland. So they start early on, and these are in their letters, in Dole and Thurston's letters, and Hyde's letters and so forth. They start early on saying, well, this is going to happen. Now, they've got a safeguard in the fact that there's 3 branches of government, right? Executive is the governor. He's appointed by the president. Judicial is appointed. The only elected is the territorial legislature. So they've got that covered. But even the legislature, they're nervous. And so they start writing back and forth about, well, Hawaiians are going to rule, so we've got to talk about how they can't rule, how incompetent they are at ruling, how horrible of a job they're doing at ruling. So this is the plan way early on. So when the territorial legislature starts in 1901, the first territorial legislature for Hawaii, that's what they start writing about in English, in the English language papers. Oh, they can't do anything, they're not passing any bills, how horrible, oh, these guys are ridiculous. And if you look at the academic work on this legislature, every single piece agrees. Gavin Dawes agrees in his book and says it was a horrible legislature that didn't get any work done. See what happens when you let Hawaiians rule? Yeah. So go back and look at the Hawaiian language sources and look at the actual minutes of the meetings and so forth in the state archives. And what you find is, now this is one example of the English language press. This is the Hawaiian Gazette of 1901, and this is a picture from the Hawaiian Gazette of the territorial legislature. If you can't see in the back there, they've got a jungle with monkeys in it. Yeah? This was the mana'o. This is what the representations they were making of Hawaiian rule. Yeah? Now, the Hawaiian language press had a different story. And you start going through the Hawaiian language press, and you find out that there were 87 bills passed that year. And all but 2 of them were vetoed by the governor. Yeah? Governor Dole had veto power. Yeah? Hawaiians passed a bill taking all the tax off of any implements used in growing taro. They passed a bill taking all the tax off taro lands. They passed a bill promoting Hawaiian language. The territorial legislature rules said the legislature will be conducted in English. Some of these men didn't speak English. They spoke Hawaiian. And so they kept conducting the legislature in Hawaiian. Governor Dole actually sent his assistant governor, Cooper, down to make sure they spoke English. But these types of bills were passed. A bill, the first county bill, which is extremely important. The county gets created in 1905. But in 1901, William Punoho White, the gentleman I mentioned earlier, and other Native Hawaiian legislators passed a county bill because they knew that would break up power from the governor, that would decentralize power. They set up counties across Hawaii, and he vetoed the bill. So Native Hawaiians were ruling, and they were doing things that their constituents wanted them to do. And the governor was vetoing it all. But you don't know that unless you access the Hawaiian language newspapers. Leka Olala Hawaii. Letters in Hawaiian. I'm going to give you one, and again, there's tens of thousands of them out there. You saw the anti-annexation petitions today. You've seen the work of the Huiloha Aina women. Here's another example. This letter is written to Sam Nolan to be forwarded to the Queen, and it's of 26 Native Hawaiian policemen in Honolulu that are resigning their positions rather than serve the provisional government. Yeah? And the thing about that is, you know, I tell my students, I said, it's not like they were quitting Walmart to go work at Jamba Juice. This was a career. This is how they fed their families. Yeah? There's some stories we'll get into later that talk about how much effect losing these government jobs had on many Native Hawaiians. Yeah? Okay, so if we haven't accessed that Hawaiian language voice, what have we accessed? What have we used to build the history of Hawaii? Why do we all know what we know? Let's talk about that for a minute, and then I'll get back into maybe the good news. We'll talk about what Hawaiians are saying. So, when I talk about a dominant narrative, what has been told about Hawaii? Again, the 6%. Yeah? Who in general am I talking about? Well, we talked about the Pacific Commercial Advertiser was the main English language paper. Okay? On the left there, you have William DeWitt Alexander, W.D. Alexander. He was a historian, he was a Board of Education gentleman, an annexation commissioner, but he was one of the most prolific historians of that period. He wrote about Hawaii. On the far right, you have Reverend Sereno Bishop. And I pause to say, not so Reverend I speak to my class all the time about the importance of not creating lists of good guys and bad guys, because some of these pictures are really gray. But Serena was a bad guy. I mean, in my heart, you know, in my Buddhist heart, I try, but, you know, he was, we'll talk about him in a minute. Okay, Pacific Commercial Advertiser. They themselves said they were an ardent advocate of annexation. And that's an important point I want to pause for a second. When you read something, because what we tend to do is pull a quote out of something and say, oh, look what this says. Who wrote that? What's his monopoly? Where does he, what position is he or she? Yeah? Who owned the Pacific Commercial Advertiser in this crucial period? William R. Castle. William R. Castle was one of the Committee of the 13. He was an annexation commissioner sent by the provisional government to the United States to give away Hawaii. He was the owner of the Pacific Commercial Advertiser. He was a member of the Committee of 13. He was appointed president of the Board of Education. You start to see the ties there? Yeah. This gentleman who's pushing annexation, who's trying to hand over Hawaii, is the president of the Board of Education. What are the schools going to teach? He wrote in the newspaper on January 17, 1893, the Pacific Commercial Advertiser said, "The foreign community is weary of Aboriginal dynasty." The editor, the newly hired editor in 1894 was Wallace Farrington. Farrington says, "The spirit of 76 is in the air, we are making history." Yeah? So, and please understand that some of the stuff we're going to get into is a lot worse than this. And Sereno Bishop says stuff, and my intention isn't honestly to get you to hate the guy. My intention is to have us all understand where our history comes from. He's a racist, and words I don't want to use now, but okay. But the fact that he's creating history is why I'm concerned. The fact that we're reading his history. So who is William Dewitt Alexander? He's the co-founder of the Hawaiian Historical Society. As historians, not only are we limited by what we choose to use to print, but we're limited by what they collect to let us see, right? He was the president. He was also a president of the Board of Education. He was president of Punahou School, and he was an annexation commissioner to Washington. He said, "Now, as the objection about the character of the existing population, it is one that would soon be obliterated by annexation. The Kanakas are a dying race, steadily diminishing at the rate of 2% per annum. This is a pity, as they are an amiable and interesting race, and under enlightened control might do well." That's what William Dewitt Alexander says about annexation. So, this gentleman, about 2 weeks after the overthrow, the Provisional Government Executive Committee comes to him and says, "We want you to write a history for us." They've sent their commissioners to Washington, but they need to create a narrative. No sane, I mean, I'm being judgmental on that, but no sane person would look at this and say, this tiny minority of the population wants to do something that everybody else doesn't want to do, we're going to agree with that. So they've got to come up with a narrative. Why is this okay? So they have W.D. Alexander write a history of the revolution they've just done. Right? And he does. He writes a book called History of the Later Years of the Hawaiian Monarchy and the Revolution of 1893. You start to see publications for its sale in the Pacific Commercial Advertiser in late February. It's only weeks after the overthrow. Come get the real, true history of the revolution that's just happened and the history of the monarchy. And here's the ad. It says, "The Hawaiian Revolution." I don't know if you can see it on the far left. It says, "accurate." In the middle it says, "impartial." And the far right it says, "breezy," which I don't know why that's important. But no, seriously, get this. The book that's accurate and impartial is dedicated by special permission to the provisional government. So you have a war. You have a war going on, and you've dedicated your history of that war to one side. And that's accurate and impartial? Who are his sources? Part 1 of his history the chapter's titled, "The Decadence of the Hawaiian Monarchy." And he says, "It is true that the germs of many of the evils of Kalakaua's reign may be traced to the reign of Kamehameha." Okay? So this is his impartial and accurate history. His sources are Dole, Thurston, Senator Morgan, the Provisional Government Executive Council, W.O. Smith, and the Reverend Sereno Bishop. There's not a royalist in there, there's not a voice of the Queen, not any of those voices are in there. Right? Now why am I picking on this book? Why is this so important? I have one here. I'm a big believer in feeling stuff and touching stuff and feeling it. So if you'd like to, please come up afterwards and I'll let you check it out. This is an actual 1899 version. It was published in 1891. This is the second publication because they had to sell more of them. This is 1899. This book was written about and was published by the Board of Education published this in 1899 and said it is very necessary to have a work of this kind in the hands of higher classes in our schools. A standard authority and school textbook for more than 40 years. This book was the school textbook for Hawaiian history in Hawaii from 1899 to 1939. This was what the Kapuna read. This is what everyone who went to school in Hawaii read as Hawaiian history for 40 years. So when we talk about why we have these histories, why we have different stories from before, that's historiography. That's how you get that history created and narrated. That was the school textbook. Okay, so we're going to move on to Sereno. The Reverend Sereno Bishop was a son of Artemis Bishop. They were the second company of missionaries came, Artemis and his wife. Reverend Sereno Bishop was his son. He was the chaplain at Lahaina, the Seamen's Chapel in Lahaina for a while. He served as a pastor in Hana for about 8 years. He was principal at Lahaina Luna High School for a while. He was also a member of the Hawaiian League, the secret organization started in the 1870s of all white businessmen and pastors and missionaries who drafted the Bayonet Constitution and overthrew to overthrow Kalakaua. He turned the Royalists my enemies. But importantly, he was a prolific writer on Hawaii and Native Hawaiians. David Forbes has written books called the Hawaiian National Bibliography, an incredible resource. He documents most documents that are out there, period. I mean, if you're looking for a Hawaiian document, check David Forbes first. And David Forbes said he was the most prolific writer of Hawaiian history at that period. Okay? So we know he's written the most. So he wrote in Hawaiian, he spoke Hawaiian. So he wrote in Hawaiian language newspapers, he wrote in English papers, he wrote special pamphlets and books and so forth. He was also editor of The Friend. The Friend was the monthly magazine that the American Protestant Church put out. So he was the editor of that. When the Queen comes to power in 1891, he writes about her in 2 American magazines. The Review of Reviews, I forget the name of the other one. But he writes about the Queen. Let's see what he writes about the Queen. He writes, "She enjoys in a high degree the affection of her Hawaiian subjects, and their confidence in her attachment to their welfare. Her gentle and gracious demeanor, her good sense and fine culture have also commanded the high regard of the foreign community." Okay, great. So he's got this respect for the Queen. He also writes, "She has a perfect use of English, a good literary, and an especially sound musical culture. The Queen's manner is peculiarly winning, her bearing noble and becoming. The Queen gives evidence of having deeply at heart the moral welfare of her people." Great, yeah? 1891. 1893, his mana'o about the Queen completely changes. Why? Because in 1891, she's under Bayonet Constitution. She has no effective power. She's not a threat. In 1893, she's a threat. And he starts to say these things about her. I have to collect myself. He writes a letter on January 13th, 1893, which is 4 days before the overthrow. He writes a letter to his friend in Boston. He says, "We shall now be delivered from that incubus of the palace, poisonous to the natives and a perpetual threat and hindrance to white civilization." So he calls her an incubus, yeah? And this is 3 days before. You know, he knows what's going on. And he also writes a letter to his friend in Boston named Gorham Gilman. And he refers to the Queen often, as the missionaries sometimes did, as Lil, knowing that it was important to Hawaiians that her name be pronounced. And he says, "My sister in New York," the Queen is in Washington and New York fighting for the kingdom. And he writes, "My sister in New York sends me a story clipping of the most sickening laudation of Lil and her talk about Hawaiians. What Lil calls the downfall of her nation due to the missionaries is really a redeeming movement for them. They have been doing much better under the Republic, and now we are striving to lift them up into noble promotion to U.S. citizenship." And he writes, "But for the missionaries, Elle herself would have rotted away early as a common low creature." Yeah. So you know, this is what he is writing about the Queen. And again, the reason why I'm interested in this, the reason why I'm picking on Sereno is because he's producing stuff that we all ended up hearing. Yeah? Not necessarily that quote, but the books and the pamphlets and the newspaper stories that were taken by historians in the 20s and 30s and 40s and written about in Hawaii. The most effective means of propagation that he had was that in 1894, the provisional government gets together with a newspaper man from the United States, and they hire Sereno Bishop as the Associated Press column correspondent for Honolulu. Now many of you probably know, there's the Associated Press and the UPI. Newspapers can't have a reporter in every city in the world, so these reporters work independently, and they'll write newspaper stories and send them up on the wire, and then any paper can pay and use them. Yeah? The Associated Press column correspondent for Honolulu in 1894 was that gentleman, was Sereno Bishop. He was writing, not all, but the vast majority of news that was going back to the United States and out to the world. He was writing it. He writes these horrific columns, these racist, horrific columns about Hawaiians, why they can't rule, and so forth. He writes columns like in the New York Independent, in the Washington Evening Star, in newspapers around the East Coast. He writes columns like, and I'll give you a piece of it here. He says, "I will merely avert to the fatal demoralization which the ascendancy of the evil elements is sure to inflict upon the weak Hawaiians. We witnessed much of such evil effort from the debaucheries of Kalakaua, who was a destroyer of his own race. Every true lover of the natives must pray that the party of purity and morality may prevail. America is entering upon a new experience in governing and educating undeveloped and weak races, lifting them up into higher things. It is incredible, it seems incredible that she should begin with the idiotic blunder of treating these feeble and childish souls as grown strong men." Okay? So he writes, I'm going to skip that part. As the UP correspondent for Honolulu, I'm sorry, it's the Associated Press, I wrote the wrong title there. He wrote columns like, "Annexation is the thing desired. The Republic has developed an ability to govern. Race supremacy. The character of the opposition. The future of Hawaii. Interesting gossip about King Kalakaua's widow." He wrote, so Sereno Bishop wrote 104 columns in American newspapers, right? Now he's a reverend. I'm not Christian myself, and I have great respect for true Christians. But the Reverend Sereno Bishop, he knew he shouldn't be doing this. So he didn't write under his own name, he wrote under a pseudonym. He chose a fake name to write under. 104 of these columns. He's also an egotist, so I found his collection he kept them all in a binder. They're at the Hawaiian Mission But he wrote, in a series of over 100 columns, the Reverend Sereno Bishop updated an American audience to the affairs in Hawaii as the Honolulu UP correspondent, Kamehameha. He chose that name to write the fact that Hawaiians couldn't rule. And think about that. Now, Kamehameha had been dead for decades. No one was fooled. No one thought that a Hawaiian was writing these columns. He chose that name on purpose. And this is my monopoly, I don't know if this is in fact. I believe he chose that name to say, I'll use that name to say that you are incompetent to rule. Yeah? It was just another kind of way to put people down. So, there's his book. On the front cover, if you can see it there, it says, "Letters by Kamehameha, Sereno Bishop." He comes out in 1902 and writes in the column in the New York Independent, it says, "I am Kamehameha, blah, blah, blah." To give him the tiniest of credit, Sereno knew that he was doing something political. He knew he was going back on his Christianity. He wrote a letter to Gorham Gilman in 1899, and he says, "The Kamehameha letters are something I'll probably pay for in the post-existence." But it tells you the lengths that people were willing to go to, the lengths that these gentlemen were willing to go to create history. And kind of, I don't want to get sidetracked, but that's my dissertation looks at this fact that these Christians who were the administrators of the Hawaiian Evangelical Association were doing this. Native Hawaiian Christians were not. They were Christian and they were royalists. They didn't throw aside their Christianity. And they started saying, "You guys have to be Christian." So he wrote, and we'll get through one more, and I promise we'll leave him alone. And I honestly, I want us to think about it as a historical document. What has this become that a little bit nicer form that we hear in our histories in the 1940s and 50s and 60s and 70s and even today? So the Queen is in, so the big argument in DC, as you guys probably talked about today, the big argument in DC is Hawaiians don't want to be annexed. So how are we going to do this? We're a country of democracy and will for the people. How are we going to do this? So they've got to come up with a way to argue that they shouldn't do that. So Sereno Bishop writes this column, and it's about the Hawaiian vote. And he says, "This takes us back to the point first made, that the people of Hawaii must be a party to the contract for annexation. Here is the very question to be settled. Who are the real people of Hawaii? Are they the decadent and dwindling race of Aboriginal Hawaiians who still linger in the land, a feeble and inefficient people, pushed aside from active life by the swarming Asiatics and the vigorous whites? Or are they not rather the fresh, active, brainy white race, who have by their skill and energy created the great wealth and thriving commerce of the islands, who own what they have thus created and who are manifestly the heirs of the future of Hawaii rather than the weak native race? Whites must govern. By reason of their superior capacity and force, the whites of Hawaii have become the real people of Hawaii." So Sereno Bishop makes the argument that Hawaiians aren't even Hawaiian anymore. That if you want Hawaiians to vote, then his group will vote. Yeah? That's the only argument he can make. But the thing we also need to think about is the fact that he was forced to make this argument. Yeah? Again, when we talk about Hawaiian agency and Hawaiian action, he had to make this argument because he had no other choice, because Hawaiians were standing up saying they didn't want to be annexed. They were being recognized, they were speaking. They were making a stand and saying these guys are being ridiculous. He had no other argument to make other than this ridiculous argument that we can look at today. So, get all that out. So let's look at what Hawaiians were saying and doing. If we look at the far left there, we have Robert Wilcox. If we look next to him, we have a local gentleman. I wanted to include a couple of people from this area in this presentation. On the second thing there, you have W.H. Daniels. Very, very important figure. He was a judge, he was a circuit court judge for Wailuku. His family it's Cop Daniels. Who am I thinking of? He wrote On Being Hawaiian. John Douglas Holt, thank you. John Douglas Holt is a descendant of the Daniels. But Judge Daniels refused to sign the oath of allegiance to the provisional government and was fired from his job as a judge here in Wailuku. The vast majority of people in Wailuku petitioned to bring him back, even non-Hawaiians, and the government refused. He ended up going to prison with Wilcox. Next to him is Reverend Hihio. He's the gentleman standing. There's two gentlemen there. That's Reverend Hihio from Ka'anapali. Reverend Hihio was a native Hawaiian pastor who was trained in the North Pacific Missionary Institute in Honolulu and became pastor of Ka'anapali, which was a Apana church, a side church of Waitangi Church in Lahaina. Reverend Hihio was written about in the provisional government meeting minutes. They have these spy reports. He was written about as one of the main gentlemen bringing in guns and ammunition and arms for Huila Island. So he also was on a list of people who refused to sign the oath of allegiance. So that's Reverend Hihio. Next to him is John Henry Wise. John Henry Wise is a gentleman I've been intimately researching over the last few years and written an article about recently in the Hawaiian Journal of History. John Henry Wise was chosen by the Hawaiian Evangelical Association to go to the United States to be trained and come back and bring Hawaiians back into the church. We'll talk about him in a little bit. And then on the far right, we have Judge Daniels again. So what kind of acts? And please understand, I'm going to show you 3 or 4. There are, I'm sorry repeating myself, there are hundreds and hundreds of these types of actions that Hawaiians are doing constantly. Kawaiahao Seminary, 1886, Kalakawa's Jubilee. Kalakawa's big Jubilee was a week-long event. Kawaiahao Seminary had a board of trustees. Albert Francis Judd, the Reverend Charles McEwen Hyde, and the Reverend Sereno Bishop were the trustees for the Kawaiahao Seminary. The princess, Lili Uokalani, who was heir apparent at the time, was a good friend of Kawaiahao Seminary, had funded many of the girls to go there, had given them extra money for books and clothes and so forth. The princess herself went and personally invited the girls to come to the Jubilee, and they were ecstatic. There were 3 Hali teachers there that were ecstatic. They got together with the girls, they started making flyers and banners for the King's Jubilee, and Reverend Sereno Bishop said, no, they can't go. And he wrote and said, no woman should fall under that heathen's gaze. And he refused to let them go to Kalakawa's Jubilee. And so what did they do? Did these docile, passive Hawaiians say, oh, okay. No, the girls at Kawaiahao Seminary said, no, we're going to go. And they not only said we're going to go, they organized a protest and they petitioned to have all 3 of these gentlemen removed as trustees. And they were successful. By February, all three of these gentlemen resigned as trustees of Phi Alpha Seminary. And that comes directly from the action of young Native Hawaiian women. So why isn't that story in our history books? Kani I Ka Po is a chapter from my dissertation, and I'm trying to keep it short. So the story I had always heard, and the story I think many of us kind of still think today and talk about, is that the American missionaries came in 1820, missionized Hawaiians, and kind of end of story. That erases Hawaiian agency. That pretends that Hawaiians were a pushover. Yeah? When you start looking at the churches, that organization, the first thing that I want to do, and I hope everyone takes this out, the first thing I want to do is, we talk about that association. So the Americans that come over here in 1820, the American missionaries, are from the ABCFM in Boston. And they believe strongly, they're Congregationalists. So they believe strongly that the power resides in the individual congregations. They're hugely anti-Catholic because they believe the Pope has too much power. Power should be in the individual congregations. An individual should be able to read the Bible himself and have a relationship with God. It doesn't matter, the pastor isn't as important, the bigger churches, the organizations aren't as important, it's the congregations. So they come, many Hawaiians become Christian. In 1853, the ABCFM declares success. They declare Hawaii a Christian nation. We've succeeded, now come on home. The sons of the missionaries kind of like it here, and they don't want to come on home. And they have a difficult time handing over power. Okay? And so Rufus Anderson, who's in charge of the ABCFM in Boston, comes out here and gives a fiery speech, and he tells them, in 1863, and he says, we want native-run, native-led churches. This is from Boston. This is what the Boston group is saying. They're saying, you guys, you've been here for 43 years. It's 1863, and they've ordained 4 Hawaiian ministers. So they say, so they kind of kick them and say, hey, come on, more Hawaiian ministers, turn over the power to the congregations. So the gentlemen that are here, Reverend Hyde and these gentlemen have been here for a while, start to say, are getting nervous. How are we going to keep control of the population if we don't have control of all the churches? In 1863, they set up their own association here in Hawaii called, what has always been called, the Hawaiian Evangelical Association, the HEA. If you go into any library or museum around here, they'll call it the HEA, Hawaiian Evangelical Association. It's not. That association was an administration that was all haole, about 9 guys, and it was a body of about 14,000 native Hawaiians. Yeah? The official language of that association was Hawaiian. It says it in the Constitution. They made English language reports to send back to Boston, but it was a Hawaiian association. It was run by these haole gentlemen, but it was very much a Hawaiian association. It was called Ahahui Wanalilo o Hawaii. Yeah? They started to, in their congregations, notice that their administration was siding with these events that they didn't care for. When we talk about the church being involved in the overthrow and annexation of Beta and so forth, yeah, we always kind of talk about it esoterically. I want to give you some facts, because it was people. Yeah. There were 5 officers of the Ahahui Wanalilo o Hawaii, 5 haole officers, who were authors of the Bayonet Constitution. Yeah. They were involved in the Bayonet Constitution. Right? So in the churches, what happens? What are you doing? You're passing this stuff. The churches rise up and resist. At the overthrow on January 17th, 1893, what happens in the churches? These docile, missionized, Christianized, brainwashed Hawaiians, what happens? No. The 2 days after the overthrow, mass meetings start around the islands. Where do they happen? In the churches. In the churches. And they pray. They don't. So they see their administration doing this, and they don't blame God. They don't blame their religion. They blame these gentlemen. And they say, we're calling on God to be on our side. They start prayer fast meetings at Kaumakapili, is one of the main places. Kaumakapili down here. And the reason why I call it Kani I Ka Po, and this is the image that really struck me for my dissertation chapter, was I started reading through the Hawaiian newspapers. 4:30 in the morning, the bell at Kaumakapili Church would ring. Now think about that. Much smaller town back then. The thing I like to think about is that Thurston Dole guys probably woke up like that. I mean, 4:30 in the morning, the bell at Kaumakapili resounds throughout Honolulu, calling Hawaiians down to pray for the return of the Queen and the ouster of their administration. Yeah? So they're not docile, they're not giving it. They're saying, we're going to get rid of you. Yeah? And these meetings they happen at Waine'e Church in Lahaina. Waine'e Church was one of the centers of Hawaiian resistance. Yeah? Kaumakapili, it happens on Kauai, it happens on Hawaii Island, it happens throughout the islands. Molokai was huge, Kaluaha, all of these churches were centers of resistance against not only the provisional government, but their church administration. The Queen said it the best. She said on February 5th, 1893 in her diary, she says, I've never seen such unchristian-like men as these set of missionaries. Yeah? So, but the important part for me is that, again, the Hawaiians didn't toss off their Christianity because of this. They tossed off their administration. They claimed, their Hawaii administration said, you will either be Christian or you'll support the Queen. They said the Queen is a heathen, God is with us, God's on our side, and they said, no, we know what Christianity is. We have a relationship with God. We are royalist Christians. We've talked to you, Noe Silva and others, Noe Silva is my kumu, and she's the one kind of urging me to say that, you know, say I kind of missed this. Because when we talk about resistance today, we don't talk about the church. Because I think we still have that thing in our mind that, like, well, you're either a strong Hawaiian sovereignty activist or you're a Christian. The kupuna in the 1890s were both. Yeah? And it started in churches like KANI I Ka Po. So here's one of the papers. And I'm embarrassed because my kumu is here. These are my translations, but hopefully they're good enough. So, some of the public have been annoyed at hearing that the bell ringing at Kamakapili Church every dawn at the hour of 4 and 4:30, calling Hawaiians, the women and men, to assemble at this morning prayer meeting concerning the requesting of prayer for the return of the Queen and the throne. So 4:30 in the morning. And another really neat part I found out about was, I was thinking about, why were they doing it at 4? And then I remember, it clicked in my head, martial law was instituted. You couldn't be on the streets from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. So the minute that they could, Hawaiians rang the bell to call the kupuna down to the church to pray. William Punahou White. William Punahou White is one of my favorite gentlemen. William White is the grandson of a man named John White. John White was a British sailor who arrived here in Hawaii in 1796. He was the first haole to settle in Lahaina. He became pili with Kamehameha I. Was given quite a bit of land, and he eventually got into Mahali and so forth. But John White married a woman named Keawe. She was a descendant of Kaiakea from Molokai. Really famous orator, yeah? One of Kamehameha's main orators. Kamehameha wrote about Kaiakea that it was the one house on Molokai where he could sleep with his malo off and not worry. Yeah? So Kaiakea is the great-great-grandson of William White. So John White is in Lahaina, marries Keawe. His grandson, William White, is born in 1851. He becomes a lawyer, a Native Hawaiian lawyer from Lahaina. He becomes a representative. He's elected to the legislature. He becomes an officer in Hui Kalai Aina. He led the push for a constitutional convention calling for an overthrow of bayonet. You know, I'm guilty also of thinking that resistance really started about 1893. No. Immediately after bayonet, in the legislature, Native Hawaiian legislators started to push, calling for a constitutional convention to overthrow bayonet. The petitions also started, the petitions that were handed to the Queen in 1891 also started, but in the legislature they started pushing for an overthrow of bayonet, and William White was the leader of that movement. The Queen writes in her own book that Sam Nolan and William White were the two gentlemen who convinced her to push for a new constitution, and were the authors of that new constitution. She writes about that she was nervous about taking this step, and William White and Sam Nolan were the ones who convinced her to do this. She was, as I mentioned, on January 14th, 1893, she goes to the executive building and prolongs the legislature. She ends the legislature for that year. She comes back across the street. Behind her comes Hui Kalai Aina carrying the Constitution. They go into the palace. Before she gets ready to sign the new Constitution, she goes into the Blue Room and meets with Joseph Navahi and William White and gives them both the Knight's Order of Kalakaua, the highest order of the kingdom. So one of the most important Native Hawaiians in our history, and we don't know him. He started a newspaper. When Hui Kalai Aina, the anti-annexation group, one of the petition groups, wanted to start a newspaper in 1897, they started a newspaper. They had William White and 3 other gentlemen go out and start that paper. The first paper, they eventually ran a paper called Kalolea Kalai Aina that we have now, and it's been documented, people written about it and so forth. But they had a first paper. They had a paper called Aha'ilono o Hawaii, yeah, that he was the editor of for 9 months. They printed 5,000 copies a week for 9 months, and I haven't found a copy anywhere in existence. I say that just in the hopes that one day some kupuna will go home and say, "Oh my gosh, what is this in my attic?" and call me. So we don't have a copy of his paper, that Aha'ilono o Hawaii. It's not in any archive, in any library here. But he was the editor of that paper. an incredibly important Native Hawaiian legislator. In doing a presentation on him a few years back, I was blessed to meet several of his great-grandchildren. I've become close with them, we'll talk. I'll tell you that story maybe later when I collect myself. Oops. So one of the things that I saw, and I've got dug up these several hundred documents on William White, and Pele Iolani is his name, and I was sitting with him. I used to go meet with him on Saturdays and stuff like that, and I didn't want to be in LA, so I don't just kind of listen and sit with him. And one day he asked me, he said, "Ron, is there anything you want to know? What do you want from this?" Because I was handing him stuff, and I said, "Well, I've never found his grave. I've never been able to find his grave. His wife is buried at Ka'ahumanu Cemetery near Bishop Museum, Queen Kaahumanu Society, and several of his children are, but I couldn't find his grave anywhere." And he said, "I'll take you." Kalamai. So his niece, he's 83. So his niece picked me up one day, and him and I went, and we were driving, and I'm watching where we're going. And we turned up School Street, and we go up to Ka'ahumanu Cemetery, and I'm like, "He's not here, I've looked." And he showed me his grave, and it's just a mound of dirt. And I'm like, "He's in it," and I'm like, So I realized he's in an unmarked grave. And so I go to the Ka'ahumanu Society, and I ask the curators there, and they have an original map of the layout of the land. And I look, and that's where he's buried. So the reason why I get emotional about it is because as a historian, he's the stories we should be hearing. We have a 40-foot bronze statue of President McKinley, or the Lugu for God's sake. We have a brand new $150 million Dillingham Freer housing department at UH Manoa. And William White sits in an unmarked grave in Honolulu. That's the effect of history. Color mine. So, John Henry Wise, I'm almost done, I promise. John Henry Wise was a 19-year-old student, the first class of Kamehameha schools. He went to Hilo boarding school. His father is German, his mother was Hawaiian, his mother Rebecca Nava'a. His father was Julius Wise from Germany, Hamburg. He had a mission education his entire life. And the reason why I love his story is he's a perfect example of what I've been talking about earlier. He goes to Hilo boarding school. William Brewster Olison is the principal. He comes out here from New England, and he's the principal at Hilo boarding school. He's also a member of the Committee of 13. He's a strong annexationist. So he's the principal at Hilo boarding school. They create Kamehameha schools. He becomes the first principal of Kamehameha schools. He brings John Wise and some other Native Hawaiians who are kind of his star pupils into Kamehameha schools. So John Wise is in the first class of Kamehameha. He starts the baseball team there. There's a great picture of him playing baseball. So Hawaiians are, from the 1850s on, Hawaiians have been leaving the American Protestant churches quite a bit. They've been joining other churches like the Anglicans and the Mormons and the Catholics and so forth. They didn't really like the way these gentlemen were speaking about them and treating them. So they were leaving the churches. But many didn't. Those who stayed within the American Protestant churches were claiming those churches and making them their own. As the numbers are diminishing, as the roles of these churches are diminishing, the administration of the churches is nervous. And so they say, they're not listening to us anymore, so let's get a Native Hawaiian to bring them back into the church. So they choose John Henry Wise as their savior. We're going to train him to the hilt. He's going to bring Hawaiians back into the church. So in 1890, they send John Henry Wise to Oberlin College in Ohio. And he gets on a ship, and he travels by ship to San Francisco, a 19-year-old kid from Kohala, and he goes by train to Oberlin, Ohio. And he is at Oberlin. He's 7 days a week in classes and does amazing. He wrote home about 65 letters that are at the Hawaiian Mission Children's Museum. Beautiful letters he wrote home. And he talks about his classes. He talks about how his math teacher pointed out that she wished all of her students had been educated in Hawaii because he was the star of the class. And so he writes a really wonderful letter about when he first arrives about how his funds are low because he had to go out and buy a lot of long underwear. It's Ohio, yeah, it's next to Lake Michigan. And the other kind of side story that's really interesting for me is, so they start a football team at Oberlin in 1891, and John Wise joins the team, becoming the first Native Hawaiian to play college football in America. And we didn't talk about that. He's the first native Hawaiian to play college football in America. 1891, he played football at Oberlin. There were 7 deaths that year in college football. They didn't wear helmets, they didn't wear pads. They basically locked arms and bumped heads. But he was the right guard. He was written about in a paper. I found articles about him in Berkeley papers. He was a star. He was a football star. He wrote a letter home saying, "Don't tell my mom I'm playing football." But so 1891 they played, they do okay. 1892 they didn't have a coach. This guy shows up from the University of Pennsylvania. He was a law student at the University of Pennsylvania. True story, I'm not making this up. He was struck by lightning, and he couldn't go into law, so he decided to coach football. He had played football at Pennsylvania. So he comes down to his hometown in Ohio, and goes to Oberlin and says, "Hey, I'll coach your football team." And they're like, "We don't have any money." He's like, "I don't care, I'll coach anyway." And he coaches them, and he was brilliant. He was a brilliant mastermind of football. And the team goes 9-0. They defeat Michigan twice. They defeat Ohio State, and they go undefeated. They're written about across the country as the Oberlin championship team. And John Wise was one of the stars. Their football coach was John Heisman. The Heisman Trophy, the top award in college football today. This kid from Kohala played football for him in 1892. That's stuff we should all know. I've written a story about that in the Hawaiian Journal of History that is out in the new journal that's coming out in February. If you're over on Oahu, come to the event. We're launching it. So, but that's a story we should be telling our kids. That's a story that they should be telling the UH football team. Anyway, I'm sorry I got sidetracked. But so John Henry Wise is at Oberlin, playing football. He's a star, but he's also studying 10 hours a day. He's immersing himself. He goes during the summers to the Moody schools, these evangelist schools up in New England, right? And he gets another immersion. And he impresses Reverend Moody. He gives the closing speech at the conference, a 10-minute closing speech at the conference. He takes music lessons and singing lessons to help his voice, preaching voice. And so he writes these beautiful letters home. His Christianity is real. He writes, "I'm coming home to serve Christ." They bring him home in May of 1893. So he was gone at the time of the overthrow. The narrative that he's getting is the narrative from the church, from the Friend and from Serena Bishop. And so he arrives home and he's going to serve them. He's going to go out to the churches. And he goes home first to see his mom at Iole Church in Hilo. And he goes home to see his mom, and he goes to the church congregation, and there's a big tussle at the congregation that Sunday. And what's going on is the pastor, now I think it's important to point out that this wasn't a native versus white binary. If you were native and for the provisional government, you were out too. The native pastor of Iole Church, the congregation was kicking him out. Was kicking him out of the pulpit because he had gone to visit President Dole and congratulate him on what had happened. The administration had taken all the native pastors down to go visit Dole, and some of them refused to go, but some of them went. And those who went got in trouble when they went home to their parishes, congregations. So Wise says, "What's going on? What's going on?" And so he goes out and he visits the churches around the islands, especially when he goes to Molokai. He's really affected, and he says, "Wait a minute, you're giving away my nation. You've dethroned my queen." And so it takes him barely any time to turn around and say no. And Reverend Hyde writes a great letter, and he says, "We just spent $3,000 on this kid, and now he's a royalist." And Wise gets arrested in the Wilcox Rebellion as one of the prime movers and shakers behind the overthrow. He gives testimony at the hearings at the court martials. Not court martials. They're under martial law. They're having these hearings about the Wilcox Rebellion, and the Queen is being tried. And I forget the date, Mount Calamai, I think it's the 15th of February. But the Queen, it's her day for trial, but right before she's tried, John Wise is tried. And some of the people who are tried, confess and turn state's evidence and get short things. He refused. He refused to say a word. He said, "Yeah, I did this." And he gets a 3-year term. He goes to prison. Throughout that next year, prisoners are released throughout the year, 1895. They're pardoning prisoners the whole year, kind of trying to make good to the foreign community, the Republicans, trying to show off that, "Oh, see how nice we are." They're letting Hawaiians go out of prison. John Wise is the last group of 8 to be released. And there were people that had 30 and 40-year sentences that were released before he was. He had a 3-year sentence. He was kept in prison. Why? Because he refused to serve them as a minister. He's released on New Year's Day, 1896. He goes back home He becomes a member of the Home Rule Party, a leader of the Home Rule Party. He goes and he proposes and passes here in Hawaii the bill that becomes the Hawaiian Homelands Act in Washington, D.C. This is a picture of him on the far left. Kuhio is up there too. But he passes the Hawaiian Homelands Bill. And I want to say something about that. There are some other scholars that I very much respect who have kind of attacked Wise for this. And I think everything needs to be taken in context. And this is only my monologue. But in my monologue, if you read his letters, and you read his motivations, and you go through everything he's written, you see that he's writing about the fact that he truly believes that the extinction of his race is at hand. He truly believes that there will be no more Hawaiians in 20 years. So yes, the Hawaiian Homelands Bill gave up a lot. And that's what some of the other scholars said. How could you make this deal that gives this power to the Big Five? How could you make a deal on blood quantum? Well, two things. First of all, that commission had no power in Washington. They didn't have a vote. The delegate to D.C. could say things and propose things, but they couldn't vote. So they had no power. It's not a very good bargaining position to be in. So they didn't have any power, and he truly felt like the thing that would save his race was putting Hawaiians on the land. And so and I would argue, I'm not Hawaiian, I'm not a Hawaiian Homelands person, but I would argue that those families that are on Homelands today would thank him. So he made that decision in 1819 to push hard for what he thought would save his race. For John Henry Wise. So these stories, I've shared a few stories with you from Hawaiians, and I'm telling you there are thousands. There are thousands. One of my favorite authors, Salman Rushdie, wrote a memoir recently, and he said that his father told him, as his father was a historian, and he told him, don't ever write about something until you hear voices. And I do. I've heard voices for years now. When I go in the archives, my Hana auntie told me one time I was looking for something and I couldn't find it, and she said, did you pull it? But remembering to go into the archives in the right way, remembering to listen. You hear stories, you hear voices. Those are the stories we need to all listen for, and those are the stories we need to all retell. Yeah, we need to retell them and retell them and retell them. And one of my favorite quotes from a Nigerian writer, and I'll finish with this. And this is why I do what I do. In my 20s, I was much more of a political activist, and I still involve myself quite a bit. I still have immense respect for that. But what I do now is tell stories, and the reason why I think that's important too is because of something like this. This is the Nigerian writer Ben Okri, and he talks about stories. He says, in a fractured age, when cynicism is God, here's a possible heresy. We live by stories. We also live in them. One way or another, we are living the stories planted in us early or along the way, or we also are living the stories we planted, knowingly or unknowingly, in ourselves. We live stories that either give our lives meaning or negate it with meaninglessness. If we change the stories we live by, quite possibly we can change our lives. So, mahalo.
Back in 1893, who can these people be? In the middle of the sea, sing a song of sovereignty, Aohimalahini. She ruled her people with grace and dignity, showing all the world the importance of unity. Oni pa'a, amaro until we die. Any enemy of Hawaii is an enemy of mine.
Abu meke oneka enter slavery, and me no wanna go. We go fight, give us the freedom, to heal our nation. We refuse to, we are united.